Well, the weather outside is no longer frightful, but I'm afraid that this planter box, it kind of is. And while it looks like a nice sunny day out today, and it really is, you wouldn't believe this, but just a week ago there was 4 inches of snow out here. But we're getting to that time of year where it's time to start switching to outdoor projects, and because we want to be ahead of the planting season, we need to start with this one. So in today's build, I'll be taking out this whole planter box here and replacing it with something that looks a little nicer and is a little bit more functional, allows us to have still something of a walkway going to the back of our yard. I'm looking forward to the build, though maybe I'm not looking forward to the shoveling. A quick note about the materials that I'm going to be using. And I don't want to use the existing materials. One, because they're pretty old and they've already seen some damage to them, but also they are treated wood. And I'm not a big fan of using treated wood right into a planter box where those chemicals might mix a little bit with the soil. So instead I want to use a naturally resistant material, wooden material. And to do that, what I'm going to do is use these 2x4s, which are redwood, and this cedar, which is about 1x6. The redwood is going to make up the frames of the boxes that I'm doing, and I'm going to panel the insides of those with this cedar, which I'm going to turn into kind of a shiplap material. Now, in order to stay weather resistant, I'm going to have to connect it with weather resistant materials as well. So I'm going to be using these decking screws to attach a lot of the frame together, and I'll also be using some electro-galvanized staples to put them together. One other thing that I'm probably going to use once I have the boxes all put together is I'm going to line it, I think, with a little bit of plastic just to give it a little more of that water resistance to the actual wood. I live in a very arid climate, so the outside isn't really a problem, but because it's going to be watered all the time, I think I'll try and put a liner in there just to keep some of that water from getting into the wood all the time. With that, let's get started putting it all together. The build begins by my shortening the rail pieces on the frames. I'm taking about 6 inches off here. These are 10-foot 2x4s, and I do want my planter box to be about 10 feet long. The reason that I cut these off a little shorter was that I wasn't quite sure how I wanted the finished top to look. One possibility was that I just left the frames the way they are. But another possibility was that I took some 2x4s and tipped them on their sides and used mitered corners to make a nice frame on the top as well. If I was going to use the frame top, I needed the full length boards for that frame, and they would extend a little bit past the frame that I had for the box itself, which is why I needed to cut them off. With the boards at their intended length, I used a palm router to rabbet out the ends. I went 3/4 or halfway down, and I went 3/4 back as well. Cutting out 3/4 at a time can be a little rough on the router, so I did it at 3/8 first and then set the depth to 3/4 and went back over. The stiles of the frame are a bit more of a manageable length, so I just cut those out on my miter saw. After the first one is measured, there's no need to measure the others, you can just use it as a guide. Now I need to rabbet out the long lengths on both the rails and the stiles of this frame because that's where the paneling pieces are going to go in. Doing that is quite a bit easier on the table saw using a dado blade, but if you don't have that, you can use the router to do everything. This piece of tape that I'm putting down on the table saw is a guide for me to know where exactly to place the end of the stile piece so that I get exactly 3/4 of an inch off. I can use that guide to cut off both sides of the piece and align them up just perfectly. In case you're following along though, you don't want to follow what I'm doing right here because I'm making a mistake. That mistake becomes quite obvious here where I try to line the pieces up. You can see when I try and fit them so that they work together as a frame, I don't have the grooves on the right side for the panel. It's an easy mistake to make, so let me try and help you avoid it. To begin with, you would cut out the rabbets that would support the panel, and that would be on the long lengths of the rails and the stiles. On a normal shop project, I would miter the corners off and put those panels together this way. And I think that's what threw me off. In the style that I'm going for with this planter box, I don't want that rabbeted edge going all the way to the end. I actually want part of it cut off. So here's a good look at what it should look like in case you're doing this on your own. As for me, I'm going to have to start over and cut 8 new stile pieces for my frames. and then I can go back and rabbet them the correct way. Fortunately, it's not a complete loss of the material because I do find a use for these pieces a little later on. And as you can see, this way did work, and I do wish I had tested it after cutting 2 of them instead of 8. With the pieces cut correctly, I could assemble the frames together. I found on the long ones, the easiest thing to do was to just clamp them in place and then screw it down because it was just so much longer than my assembly table. I used 2 screws on each connection, and it was definitely a help to put a pilot hole in there first in order to keep the wood from splitting. With the 4 short ones done in that pile behind me, and now the 4 long ones done as well, I can turn my attention to the cedar paneling. The paneling is going to be done by placing vertically oriented strips of the cedar boards inside of those paneling grooves in the frame. The planks have a smooth side and a rough side. I want the smooth side to be facing outward, so I need the rough side to be facing up towards me as I assemble it. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I originally wanted to have shiplap type grooves connecting all of these cedar planks together. I found when I laid it out though that it really didn't matter if I had those overlaps or not. And since it was more work to put those shiplap grooves inside of there, I decided to skip that whole process. The edges of these boards were rough cut though, so in order to get a real good lineup on the 2 abutted edges, I needed to run them through the jointer first. To give it a uniform look, I started in the center with those panel pieces and just worked my way back and forth. The pieces were thick enough that I decided to not use staples, I just used screws to connect them all together. The final step in assembling the panel was to put those 2 end pieces in that were cut down to the appropriate length. It came out looking pretty nice. Now I'd like to avoid having a bunch of screws showing up in my nice planter box. So I figured that the best way to assemble them would be to take a 2x2 and stick it on the inside corners and drill in through those. I didn't have any 2x2s on hand, but what I did have was 8 pieces of improperly cut redwood already at the right length that I could cut down into 2x2s. That gave me the 8 pieces that I needed into the corners, and it left over these 8 L-shaped pieces. But don't worry, I'm going to find a use for those as well. For now, I'm just going to finish up on these 2x2 pieces by pre-drilling them to make the assembly a little bit easier later on. With the shop work done, it was time to go outside and start the demolition. And I find that demolition is always best done using time lapse. Our poodle, Nova, took a pretty keen interest in what was going on. Either that or she just liked having the ball thrown for her as I was taking everything apart. Assembly begins by putting those 2x2s onto the shorter, more manageable ends of the box, right up against the edges. I could have done this step inside the shop, but it's a pretty nice day out, so I enjoyed doing it outside. The assembly process is pretty simple. You just have to line everything up first, and then the screws go right in and attach it all together. Sometimes you use your foot as a lever to keep everything in place, and sometimes you use a shovel. And just in case it wasn't entirely clear what was going on, here's the inside view of me doing the same process, just at the other end. The plan was to keep the planter box 2 feet away from the deck and from the fence, and I have a 2-foot square that's helping me figure that out. And then I use my level just to make sure everything is in the right spot, throwing a little dirt under it if I need to make any changes. As I mentioned earlier, I wanted to put a plastic lining around before I filled it all up with dirt. I tried 2 different staplers with this, one a hand stapler and the other pneumatic. The pneumatic one was quite a bit faster, but it also was a little too strong for the application, and I ended up going back to the hand stapler. The box was done, so there was nothing left to do but fill it up, and that meant digging. But hey, look how fast I am. It was time to move my attention to the second box, but for those of you who were concerned about that rosemary plant, I wanted to show you that I replanted it first. Assembling the second box was done just the same way as the first, so we'll go through it pretty quickly. There was one minor difference. On the side facing the deck, the ground slopes away from the box. That meant that I didn't have any support holding the box in place as I was going to fill it up with dirt. To counteract this, at least temporarily, I put a board in there which I attached with screws at the bottom of the box. Now this board is only going to last maybe a few years before it rots away, so I am going to have to go back and add a little bit of support on that deck side. The box is finished up with a little more of my amazingly fast digging. So the planter boxes are all done, but I have all these cut-offs left over of the cedar and some redwood too. I had a little bit of an idea on how maybe we could enhance the planter box, and it's going to involve the laser. The pieces of 1x6 cedar I ripped down to 2.5 inches. The L-shaped redwood I took over to the bandsaw instead and ripped it down there, separating it so that it no longer had that L shape. Then, while the laser did its engraving work, I took the redwood pieces and began assembling them together so that they could later attach to the cedar pieces and make hanging signs that would label the plants in the planter. And since the laser was quite a bit slower at engraving than I was at assembling, I headed back outside and I filled in the spot in between the two planters with some additional gravel. Finally though, the laser got its job done. I finished up the signs and I was able to hang them onto the planter. Well, the planters are all done and they look great. They're approved by everyone in the family, including Nova. Now she can run through here without having to step on any of our plants. It's an accessible build. I think anybody with some basic tools could do this, and it's a great improvement to your spring planting and your planting. It's going to be a few more weeks before we're able to plant, but at least we're ready for it. If you like this video, I'd love it if you hit like and you subscribe. It helps other people find these videos, and it'll help you find a future build video that I do as well. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you on a new one. Good job, Nova.